trickle down economics with quotes, air quotes around it. Trickle down economics. This is one of those terms that you hear about trickle down economics, or some sort of suggestion is made about limiting usually some type of spending or government intervention into the economy. And usually one of the trump cards thrown out is, well, trickle down economics didn't work. Trickle down economics, this and that. Now, trickle down economics has built into it this idea that you could imagine, this kind of concept of, like maybe at a wedding or some sort of party or something, that sometimes they make a pyramid of champagne glasses, and the idea is, okay, if you pour down champagne into the top glass, it will overflow, creating a waterfall effect that will trickle down into the rest of the glasses. And wow, that you may have seen that. It's argued that, well, that's not an effective economic strategy. Usually trickle down economics is used as a dismissive label for some type of suggestion on government limits of intervention into the economy. Now, what trickle-down economics actually is, the definition of a so-called trickle-down economics, is government giving advantages or money, resources to the wealthy, in the idea of that benefiting that class, if you will, that income bracket. In doing so, will create some jobs and some other things that will benefit other people, in other words, trickle down. However, the problem with the terminology and the definition is that trickle-down economics does not exist. Now, certainly there are some people that believe aspects and elements of that idea, but you cannot find an economist that believes that the government ought to give money to the wealthiest income bracket in order for that to trickle down to benefit everyone. That in benefiting the top, you also benefit the middle and the bottom. I don't know of any economist who believes this, teaches this, has it in a textbook. So this dismissive name of, oh well, it's trickle-down economics, it's proven not to work, it's Reaganomics, that's the idea, the supply side, that just has been proven to be unfruitful. Where the terminology actually came from was from Mr. Rogers. That's right, Fred Rogers came before Congress in the 1960s or 70s, I don't remember. The clip can be found easily on YouTube, to request funding for, I think it was PBS, but for federal funding for educational television programming, like Mr. Rogers. And so he said, kind of an offhand remark, there should not be this trickle down, of giving money to the wealthy, the politically connected, in the hopes that it would trickle down to everyone else. Now, the other side, that teachers believe and speak about, I'm actually borrowing this terminology from a history professor, a good history professor, but he said, well, why not the opposite? Let's give it to the lowest level of the pyramid, the income bracket, and we'll believe in fizzle up economics. So the idea is, okay, that trickle down economics doesn't work. Here's some of the problems with that. Number one, the definition doesn't exist. Okay, no economist even believes that. So to speak against it is a logical fallacy called the straw man fallacy. It's to erect a position that does not exist in order to argue against it, insinuating that it is someone else's position that they do not hold. That's logical fallacy number one when people are speaking about trickle-down economics. Logical fallacy or problem number two, the presupposition that government gives these privileges and resources. Now, that word give indicates not only possession but ownership. Now, government, by definition, receives whatever it gives, it must receive coercively through taxation. That's nothing surprising. Governments do that. So the idea that the government can give to whom it wills, it's giving something that it does not in and of itself generate or simply voluntarily receive, but gets through tax money. Now, we do see that government does in fact dole out money, resources, and privileges. And they're often to the entities that are wealthy and politically connected. Here, which leads to the third problem with the accusations of trickle-down economics. Trickle-down economics assumes that the wealth at the top will trickle down to the bottom. So those who argue against such a thing, in arguing against it, they actually argue the same thing on a few different bases. Meaning this, just depends on where you start the top. Because if the top is the wealthy income bracket, and it trickles down, okay, people who say, okay, well, trickle down economics doesn't work. Instead, let's have the government confiscate coercively through taxation those resources and that it be in charge. And then it will decide to whom to give those resources. Now, the assumption is that government will give the resources to those at the bottom, to those most in need, to those most deserving. However, in denying the validity of trickle-down economics, those arguing against it actually argue trickle-down economics in another form. Except instead, the government is at the top is the poorer of the resources, rather than the wealthy elite in the highest income bracket. And by the way, when government does this, usually the wealthy and politically connected elite who have more of a say with government are the ones who are the first to receive it. So it's just trickle-down economics of another form, which I agree is not the way to go about growth in an economy. Now, on the other side, there is growth that comes from savings and investment, job creation, and things It comes in markets. But that's not trickle-down economics. That's investment, that's capital investment that is not taken coercively, but is wealth that is generated in markets. So the problem with trickle-down economics, number one, the definition is not a definition anyone believes, or if they do. I say that if people speak for it or against it, if they use the terminology trickle-down economics, it's because they don't know anything about economics, at least in its principle level, and definitely not more advanced. So number one is the definition is one that is a straw man. Number two, trickle-down economics assumes the government as a generator of wealth and a voluntary giver, when in fact a government has to first take what it provides. And number three, arguments against trickle-down economics usually end up arguing for trickle-down economics just via the government, with the state being at the top and the controller of resources. And so that's the problem with this type of terminology.